Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for a high-speed yet rigorous tour of one of philosophy's oldest and most persistent puzzles. What is the mind, and how exactly is it fundamentally related to the physical world?
It's a huge question.
It is. And you've provided a stack of intense philosophical critiques detailing the first major, often radical attempts to solve this puzzle using purely material terms. We are looking at the thinkers who tried to eliminate the soul entirely and replace it with science.
Indeed. We are tackling the core arguments of materialism. The history of Western thought, largely thanks to René Descartes, centered on dualism, this idea that the mind, a non-physical substance, and the body, a physical substance, are distinct and somehow interact.
Right.
Materialism is the explicit denial of this position. For the materialist, every substance is material, and minds, consciousness, feelings. All of it must be constructed from the very same stuff as stars, rocks, and, well, neurological tissue.
Okay, so let's unpack this heavy material. Our mission is to analyze three specific materialist predecessors that tried to move beyond that mind as distinct substance idea.
The big three early attempts.
We've got philosophical behaviorism, the later scientific project of psychological behaviorism, and finally, the mind-brain identity theory. We need to dissect their core claims, analyze their surprisingly profound failures, because they did fail, and pinpoint which key ideas survived to shape contemporary thought on consciousness.
And this deep dive is crucial for you, the listener, because it addresses the most persistent challenge to materialism, the problem of privacy.
Privacy.
I mean, the seeming inaccessibility of your inner life to objective scientific inquiry. If a headache is nothing more than a pattern of electrical signals, we need to understand how materialism proposes to prove that, and more importantly, how it deals with the subjective feeling, the vivid reality of pain that seems utterly absent from the neurological description.
So we start with this fundamental denial of dualism. Why go to all this trouble? Why is the idea that the mind is fundamentally material, the same stuff as everything else, so compelling to philosophers and scientists?
Well, it's compelled by a desire for unity and simplicity in our worldview. I mean, materialism, as you noted, is ancient. It dates back to figures like Democritus, who envisioned reality as just atoms swirling in the void. And later in the Enlightenment, you had thinkers like Hobbes and Lametri, who saw mental phenomena as complex, but ultimately mechanical interactions of matter. If you look at the progress of science, every time we have found a phenomenon that seemed mysterious or non-physical, be it electricity, heat, or light, we eventually reduced it to a set of underlying physical laws.
And the mind, the materialist argues, has to be next on the list.
It must be next.
But the popular intuition, the common sense view, is still heavily dualist. You might read articles today and people talk about the mind and the brain as two separate entities, even if they know better scientifically. Why does dualism seem so intuitively correct?
That brings us to the famous problem of the headache.
Right.
It's because of the massive, almost unbridgeable gulf between what we experience subjectively and what science observes objectively. Take your headache again. You feel it. It's throbbing. It's intense. It has a definite location and quality.
It's very real to me.
It is. Now, imagine a neuroscientist observing your brain while you suffer. They might see certain regions light up, measure specific chemical releases, or monitor C-fiber firing patterns. What they observe is altogether different from what you feel.
I see the dilemma. The neuroscientist has a complete physiological explanation, but the subjective feeling, the qualia, what its likeness, seems completely absent from their description.
Completely.
It feels like they are missing the most important piece of the puzzle.
They're missing the subjective characteristic. If you are a neuroscientist who has never experienced a headache, you could know everything there is to know about the brain state S that correlates with the headache, but you still lack knowledge of the actual experience. And this fact, the source material notes, leads many to the conclusion that mental characteristics are simply not brain characteristics. If the feeling isn't reducible to the physical description, then, well, the mind must be something non-physical.
And this inherent mismatch leads directly to the core challenge materialism must overcome: the epistemological hurdle of privacy.
Exactly. Your experiences are private. You have direct, non-inferential access to your decision to raise your hand. You don't need evidence or observation to know you're doing it.
I just know.
But for me to know that you decided to raise your hand, I must infer it, either by observing your behavior or perhaps by observing a complex correlate in your brain. Even if I observe the brain state S, my access is still indirect. I infer the mental state by observing the physical correlate. I don't observe the state of mind itself.
And here's the scientific roadblock. Science demands objective, publicly verifiable observation. If the mind's essential characteristics are fundamentally private, they are, by definition, excluded from the scientific method.
We can study brains.
But we can only ever observe correlates shadows of the mind, not the mind itself.
And this issue of privacy deepens into something truly mind-bending, what philosophers call the qualitative resemblance paradox.
Okay, let's walk through this. Let's say we've used sophisticated scanners to establish a perfect one-to-one correlation in my brain.
Right.
Every time I experience the shade of ripe tomato red, my brain enters neurological state S. When you, the observer, see my brain in state S, and I announce I see ripe tomato red, that seems like the ultimate proof of a mind-brain link. But why is this still philosophically unsound?
Because of the epistemic asymmetry. You, in your own case, have access to both the mental state and the neurological correlate. But when you observe me, you only have access to my neurological condition, state S, and my linguistic output. It's red.
Right. I can't see inside your head.
So what gives you the right to assume that my mental state, my subjective experience of red, actually resembles yours?
Well, my common sense answer is that we both grew up speaking English, and we both point to a ripe tomato and call it red. We agree on the linguistic label, so surely the underlying experience is similar.
That's the trap.
Yeah.
That agreement only means we have both been trained by our community to characterize our respective experiences using the same linguistic label. You have your private experience, I have mine, we both call them red.
Right.
But perhaps the internal experience you have when looking at the tomato is qualitatively like the experience I would have were I to view a bright neon yellow sign. Our descriptions would perfectly coincide, but the qualia, the feel, the raw sensory data is wildly different.
Wow. So the lack of shared qualitative access means we are effectively operating with entirely different private color palettes, even though we are speaking the same language.
And this is where the inductive inference fails completely, doesn't it?
It does.
Inductive inference requires reasoning from a sample to the whole population. But when it comes to consciousness, you only have a sample of one, your own mind. Canons of induction prohibit drawing conclusions about the whole population, all other minds, from a single unrepresentative example.
You can't generalize from a sample size of one.
And if you assume your mind is representative, you have assumed precisely what you set out to establish, that your experience and mine are alike. It's circular.
This ancient puzzle, the problem of other minds, pushes us to a truly terrifying point. How can we ever know that others have minds at all, given this fundamental epistemic barrier?
Exactly. It makes the scientific study of consciousness seem impossible if we accept that privacy premise.
You can't build a science on something no one can observe but themselves.
And this is precisely why we get to the idea of the philosophical zombie. The apparent conceivability of these creatures, beings physically and behaviorally identical to us, but altogether lacking conscious experiences, lacking qualia. It highlights what David Chalmers called the explanatory gap. So long as we accept the Cartesian notion that minds and their contents are private, we are stuck. We can't bridge the gap between my brain is in state S and I feel red.
This impasse leads us to a crucial philosophical pivot point provided by Ludwig Wittgenstein. He looked at the whole problem and argued that our starting assumption that mental states are these private inner entities is what manufactured the problem in the first place.
Wittgenstein's strategy was so radical because it suggested that the dualists and the materialists alike had fundamentally misunderstood the grammar of our mental language. He was aiming to dissolve the problem, not solve it.
And he gave us the beetle in the box analogy.
He did.
Let's detail that analogy because it's a brilliant, if a little strange, way to illustrate how language operates in the public sphere.
Okay, so imagine a small community where everyone possesses a box. Inside this box is something they call a beetle, which represents their private sensation, say, the particular feeling of pain. And there is a rule. No one can ever look into anyone else's box.
So you only know what a beetle is by looking at your own.
Exactly. So my beetle is my pain, your beetle is your side of red, and there is absolutely no way to compare or verify that the contents of our boxes are similar.
So given this setup, it's totally possible for everyone to have something wildly different in their box. Or for the thing to constantly change.
Or, and this is the crucial part, for the box to be empty.
Ah.
Now here is the philosophical hammer. If the word beetle is used in the language of this community, it cannot be used as the name of a private, definite thing.
Why not? If I look in my box, feel my pain, and say, I have a beetle, and you do the same, why isn't that word a valid name for our internal entity?
Because the linguistic rules governing the use of the word beetle are necessarily public. How did we learn the word? We learned it by observing public circumstances, seeing others with boxes who say they have a beetle. But if the content of the box is permanently hidden, then that content is irrelevant to the meaning of the word.
Because the meaning has to be shared.
Right. You report a beetle, I report a beetle. The only thing that matters is the shared observable context and application of the word. The private object drops out of consideration as irrelevant. It cancels out of the equation.
So whether the box is full of pain, feathers, or is empty, the language game proceeds identically.
The only thing that matters is the public criteria for using the term. To wonder whether your beetle resembles mine is to misunderstand the function of the term beetle. It is not functioning to name or designate a definite private entity. It functions to announce a state that has public criteria for its application.
That is genuinely profound. So if we apply this to the headache, then when I utter, "I have a headache," I'm not designating some qualitatively similar, definite private entity floating non-physically within me.
You're doing something else entirely.
What am I doing?
You are merely evincing the state. It's a learned, trained linguistic response. As a child, you moan, you rub your head, you exhibit withdrawal behavior. Adults teach you that feeling is called a headache. So when you say, "I have a headache," it is an advanced linguistic form of that groan or rub.
It's a piece of behavior.
It's a piece of linguistic behavior. And when you ascribe a headache to me, you are saying that I am in a state that leads me to moan or rub my head or say, "I have a headache." The private character of that state is irrelevant to the public meaning and function of the word.
And this radical linguistic analysis forms the foundation for our first materialist candidate, philosophical behaviorism, which sought to eliminate the private entity entirely by defining mental terms only through public actions.
Exactly. This leads us straight to Gilbert Ryle.
The ghost in the machine.
Philosophical behaviorism, championed primarily by Ryle, holds that the Cartesian conception of mind errs fundamentally. Mental terms do not designate private hidden entities. They describe complex patterns of observable behavior or the dispositions to behave.
And this was an analytical project, right? Focused on purifying our language of mind.
Precisely. Ryle argued that the very idea of a non-material mind interacting with a material body was based on a category mistake.
Okay, what exactly did he mean by that?
He argued that our language misleads us. Because we use nouns like mind, belief, and intention, we assume they must refer to entities, just like brain or table refers to an entity. Ryle suggested that the dualist makes an error in logical type classification. They mistake the category of the mind.
And his specific analogy, the one about the university, makes this mistake perfectly accessible.
It's fantastic. Ryle asks you to imagine visiting a foreign friend who is showing you his university. You spend the whole day walking the grounds. You see the lecture halls, the library, the administration building. You meet the students, the janitors, and the faculty.
You see all the components.
At the end of the tour, you turn to your friend and ask, "This is all fascinating, but I haven't seen the university yet. Where is it?"
The mistake is obvious. You assume university designates an entity similar to, but distinct from, all the buildings and people you've already seen.
Exactly. And by analogy, the dualist is asking to see the mind after being shown the entire functioning person and brain. That persisting search for the elusive non-material entity is what encourages Cartesian dualism, which Ryle derided as seeing the mind as the ghost in the machine.
So Ryle's goal was simple. Expose the mistake, and the ghost vanishes.
It vanishes.
So, if the mind isn't an entity, what is it?
Minds are not entities at all, ghostly or otherwise. Rather, a creature possesses a mind in virtue of being capable of engaging in spontaneous, complex, and intelligent behavior.
So having a mind is about what you do.
What you do, or, crucially, what you would do. Your belief that there is a bear in your path is not an event happening privately inside you. It's a matter of you taking appropriate evasive measures, or assenting to the statement, "There is a bear on the path," or grabbing your camera to take a picture. It's a pattern of behavior.
But this immediately runs into a limitation. What about the stoic, the actor, or the paralyzed person? What if I believe the bear is there, but I stand completely still because I'm trained to play dead? My behavior doesn't match the belief.
Right. Or what about the person who has a terrible migraine but manages to suppress all outward signs of pain?
Exactly.
That requires the behaviorist to lean heavily on dispositions. A plausible behaviorist account requires analyzing mental terms into complex behavior or dispositions to behave. A disposition is a potentiality. what an agent would do if certain circumstances arose.
Okay, give me an example.
A fragile vase possesses the disposition to shatter, even if it sits safely on a shelf for 100 years and never actually shatters.
So even if I suppress moaning, I am still disposed to moan with a headache, were I in private, or were the pain to reach an unbearable threshold. The disposition takes up the slack.
Absolutely. You do what you are disposed to do, but you may be disposed to do many things that you never do, either because the opportunity doesn't arise or, and this is critical, because they are overridden by competing dispositions.
So philosophical behaviorism aimed for a reductive analysis.
Yes, to analyze away claims about minds and replace them with claims about behavior and dispositions, thereby showing there is nothing more to having a mind than behaving in appropriately mindful ways.
But despite the elegance of Ryle's analysis, the analytical project of philosophical behaviorism ultimately failed.
It did. It failed due to two profound issues relating to the holistic nature of mental states. The first is the open-endedness problem.
What's that?
Well, behavioral analyses are potentially open-ended. If I ask you to analyze the belief that there is ice cream in the freezer, the list behavior stemming from that belief, walking to the freezer, saying yes if asked, deciding to stop dieting, etc., is indefinitely large.
There's no end to the list of possible behaviors.
None. What you do depends on indefinitely many circumstances. The complexity is astronomical.
The behaviorist might argue that an analysis doesn't need to be finite, only that we can see how it could be extended in principle. But that brings us to the second, truly fatal issue, the interdependence problem.
This is the critical problem of holism. Any specific behavior resulting from a state of mind depends entirely on the agent's overall system of beliefs and desires. A mental state doesn't produce behavior in isolation.
It produces it in conjunction with everything else you believe and want.
Precisely.
Let's break down the bear scenario again, because this illustrates the fatal trap.
Okay. You see a bear, and you form the belief that there is a bear. What you do next depends entirely on what else is in your mind. If you believe the bear is dangerous, and D, you desire to avoid dangerous animals.
Then you run away. Simple.
Seems simple. But now change one input, one subtle belief. Imagine you still have those beliefs and that desire, but you also believe that running away will attract its attention.
Then I freeze.
Or perhaps you believe bears are attracted to loud noises, or you desire to photograph it for National Geographic.
In those latter cases, my behavior changes drastically. I might freeze, try to hide, or even approach cautiously. The belief there is a bear is compatible with literally any behavior.
Exactly. The belief that there is a bear is compatible with you behaving in any way at all, depending on the indefinitely complex context of what else you believe and want. No matter how complicated you make your behavioral analysis of belief be, a philosopher can always invent a combination of other beliefs and desires that makes you behave differently.
Or even oppositely to what you'd predict. So, to save the analysis, the behaviorist is forced to introduce what you called the circularity trap.
To save the reduction, they are tempted to include an exclusion clause. They might say, if you believe the bear is dangerous and desire to avoid it, then, provided you have no further conflicting beliefs or desires, you will be disposed to turn tail.
I see the problem.
The problem is that the exclusion clause reintroduces mention of mental states, beliefs, and desires, which are precisely the terms the reductive project was trying to analyze away in terms of behavior.
So, they were trapped. They tried to eliminate the mind by translating its terms into observable behavior, but they found that the translation required using the mental terms themselves to define the behavior. It collapsed into circularity.
Yes, philosophical behaviorism failed because mental states cannot be reduced to behavior without referencing other mental states. The mind is a holistic system, and you cannot isolate one component and define it solely by output without also factoring in intention, desire, and belief. The ghost wasn't eliminated. The reduction was rendered hopeless.
Now we pivot from the analytical failure to the scientific project. Psychological behaviorism, associated with J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. Unlike Ryle, who was trying to clean up language, these scientists were trying to define a rigorous method for psychology itself.
They held a much more rigid view of what constituted legitimate science, heavily influenced by logical positivism. Since the traditional study of mind revolved around conscious states, which are private and non-amenable to public scrutiny.
Which we've established is a huge problem.
Early behaviorists concluded that those inner states simply did not exist, or at least were not fit for serious scientific consideration. They sought to deny the existence of traditional minds and conscious experiences entirely, viewing such concepts as unscientific pre-modern superstitions.
So they weren't denying that creatures have complex, observable traits, but they deny that these traits should be explained by reference to inner ghosts or mental intermediaries.
Exactly. The governing model for explaining behavior was the stimulus response, or SR model. Behavior was modeled after the simplest reflex. Complex behavior was seen as simply the result of complex stimuli, and the mechanism connecting them was an unadorned, learned reflex.
And the organism itself, the human or the animal, became the famous black box.
That's the key metaphor. The organism is a black box. The psychologist's job is purely external, to systematically account for the relationships between observable input stimuli, or S, and observable outputs responses, or R, while ignoring any and all processes happening inside the box.
So the internal mechanisms were considered the province of the biologist or physiologist, not the behaviorist psychologist.
Correct. This gave rise to the whole system of operant conditioning, where learning was reduced entirely to simple associative mechanisms based on reinforcement.
Think of Pavlov's dogs or Skinner's rats.
Perfect examples. If a rat presses a bar at the onset of a sound, S, and receives a food pellet reinforcement, the probability of that response increases dramatically. The behaviorist strictly avoids postulating any inner process like discovery, intention, or expectation.
From a purely operational standpoint, the bar pressing simply comes to be associated with the sound through reinforcement contingencies.
It was elegant in its simplicity and scientific rigor.
This SR model was hugely authoritative, especially in North America throughout the mid-20th century. But then, starting around 1959, it collapsed almost completely under intense intellectual pressure. What was the most famous opening shot in this cognitive revolution?
It was the intellectual assault launched by the linguist Noam Chomsky in 1959. His devastating review of B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior.
Yes.
Skinner had attempted to extend the SR model to explain the acquisition and use of complex human language. Chomsky argued that this was hopelessly inadequate.
Why was language the breaking point?
Chomsky pointed out the sheer generativity of language. Humans constantly produce and understand novel sentences they have never heard before. If learning is simply the association of stimulus and response through reinforcement, how can a child possibly generate an infinite variety of new grammatical sentences?
The stimulus they receive from their parents is finite and often flawed, yet they rapidly acquire a complex, rule-based system.
That's the poverty of the stimulus argument. The input doesn't contain enough information to generate the output.
Unless we postulate innate inner mechanisms.
Precisely. Chomsky argued that you cannot explain this ability without assuming that human beings possess a sizable repertoire of complex, rule-governed cognitive structures or internal mechanisms that govern their use of language. This was a necessary step, but it required reintroducing the very inner mechanisms behaviorism sought to banish.
The black box had to be opened.
It had to be.
And even beyond language, the core definitions of stimulus, S, and response are, themselves, proved shaky and often circular, making the whole scientific structure unstable.
Very unstable. Let's start with the response problem.
Okay.
We need to ask, what constitutes the same behavior or the same response? Think back to the bar-pressing rat. If the rat presses the bar with its right paw and then later uses its left paw, we count these as instances of the same behavior, right?
Right, even though the bodily motions are physically different.
So if the physical motions are different, what makes them the same behavior from a purely objective behavioral science point of view?
It must be the outcome, the purpose. The bar is pressed, the food is obtained.
Right. But that relies on defining the behavior by the unobservable inner concept of purpose or desire for food. If the definition of the response depends on the purpose, which is a mental state, then the behaviorist has failed to eliminate the mental state.
I see. And this problem becomes far worse in human behavior.
Oh, much worse. Your door-opening behavior might be running to the door, tiptoeing, or just shouting, "Come in!" No common bodily motion, only a common unobservable intention.
And the stimulus problem mirrors the circularity perfectly.
It does. What counts is the same stimulus. Your door-answering response might be elicited by a loud bang, a soft ring, or a child's cry. These stimuli lack any common physical features.
They're completely different sounds.
So if the behaviorist cannot come up with a non-circular characterization of the door-answering stimulus, then explanations become entirely trivial. A response is elicited by the response-eliciting stimulus. The theory becomes uninformative.
It's a tautology.
Yes. S and R definitions just rely on each other in a circle. But the final blow, the one that truly necessitated opening the black box, was the realization that there must be a mental intermediary.
What does that mean?
This is the critical insight showing the SR model is fundamentally misguided for complex behavior. Return to the bear in the path. Strictly speaking, it's not the bear itself that elicits your response.
Okay.
If a bear appears, but you remain oblivious to it, perhaps you're daydreaming, you are unmoved. The stimulus is there, but no response.
Conversely, you may be moved to a bear-avoiding response, even if the bear is absent, provided you mistakenly perceive there to be a bear in your path, perhaps seeing a shadow or a stump.
Exactly. The bear's physical presence, the stimulus, only explains your behavior if it leads you to the perception of a bear. That perception, an inner cognitive mental component, mediates your subsequent behavior. The behavior is triggered by the mental intermediary, not the raw physical input.
And behaviorism was designed to eliminate these exact inner mental intermediaries.
But they are essential to explaining why a stimulus results in a particular behavior.
So both forms of behaviorism, the philosophical one that failed due to circular definitions, and the psychological one that failed due to complexity and the necessity of cognitive structures, had tried to eliminate the mind. So the next coming materialism had to be different.
Radically different.
If behaviorism failed by trying to deny the existence of the inner life, the next step in materialism was to grant the inner life exists, but simply claim it was misclassified. We now turn to the mind-brain identity theory.
The identity theory rejects the idea that mental states or events are anything distinct from physical states or events. It states boldly that mental occurrences are nothing more than goings-on in the brain or central nervous system.
So this is the strong claim. My current pain is not merely caused by a brain state, it is that brain state.
That's it. If we discover a perfect correlation between a mental state and a neurological process, say, every time I feel pain, a specific type of neuron fires, the identity theory insists they aren't merely correlated. They are the same thing.
One and the same.
If mental goings-on are brain processes, it's misleading to say they are correlated with brain processes.
Right.
Correlation implies two distinct things whose whereabouts coincide. A thing is not correlated with itself. That would be like saying the whereabouts of Clark Kent are correlated with the whereabouts of Superman.
Right.
The proponents, philosophers like Fagel, Place, and Smart, argue that these were theoretical identities.
Like the great discoveries of physics.
Yes. They argued that mental properties are identical with material properties, and this identity is an empirical discovery of science. Just as it took empirical research to find that water is H2O, or that lightning is electrical discharge, it will take brain research to find that pain is, say, the neurological property of C fiber firing.
We should take a moment to contextualize that famous example. What are C fibers, and why were they the historical candidate for pain?
So C fibers are a specific type of nerve fiber. They're slow, unmyelinated axons, and they transmit signals from the skin and deep tissue toward the central nervous system. They're specifically associated with transmitting signals that register as dull, lingering, or chronic pain.
So it was a concrete target.
It was. The choice of C fiber firing was influential because it anchored the subjective feeling of pain to a highly specific, measurable physical process within the central nervous system. It provided a concrete material candidate for a subjective experience.
So the identity theory then offers two major philosophical advantages over dualism, starting with the immediate solution to the causal interaction problem.
Right. If mental events are neurological events, then there is no special mystery about how the mind influences the body, or vice versa. There is no ghost needed to move the machine. It is simply one physical event causing another physical event, a brain state causing a motor impulse. Causation falls neatly within the physical laws of nature.
And the second advantage is parsimony, or simplicity. This is the scientific tiebreaker.
It is. Both identity theory and dualism grant the existence of brains and neurological goings-on. Dualism, however, must posit additional non-material items over and above the brain, the mental substance. If the identity theory can successfully account for all mental phenomena solely by reference to the brain's properties,
Meaning one unified kind of substance.
it wins by default.
Wow.
The principle of parsimony dictates that we prefer the simplest theory that accounts for all the facts. The burden of proof, therefore, lies squarely with the less simple dualist theory.
So, the identity theory is the champion, provided it can explain the phenomena without resorting to non-material entities. And this brings us back to the two core challenges we established earlier, the epistemological challenge of privacy and the ontological challenge of qualitative difference.
The two big hurdles.
The dualist argues, if the mind is the brain, and the brain is a public object that anyone can observe, how can my mind be private? How do we account for the asymmetry of access my direct privileged knowledge of my inner states versus everyone else's indirect inferred knowledge.
The identity theorist has to explain this asymmetry without resorting to the Cartesian picture, the beetle-in-the-box model, where the mental items are literally hidden in an inner chamber visible only to the agent.
Yeah.
And they do this by radically challenging the very idea of inward observation.
Okay, how does that challenge work?
Let's look at self-conscious thought. The identity theorist suggests that thinking is something you do, a process you engage in, not something that happens to you, like a heart beating, which you then spectate. You are not an internal observer reading a sign that says, thinking about pre-Roman Britain.
So my conscious recognition that I am thinking isn't based on an act of inwardly observing the thought, like reading a sign or taking a measurement.
It's built into the thought itself.
So?
Thought is entertained self-consciously. Your capacity to recognize the thought stems from the fact that you are about it. Think of a sculptor. The sculptor knows what the sculpture is meant to be, not because they stand back and observe it better than others, but because they are the one making the sculpture. The recognition stems from the activity itself.
So it reframes awareness of thought from being perception to being action.
Exactly.
That makes sense for thought as activity, but how does this apply to passive sensory experience, like a headache? I don't do a headache. I have a headache.
A fair point. The identity theorist applies the same logic, though. They argue against the two-step Cartesian model, which suggests you, 1, have the experience, and then 2, inwardly observe that experience.
And the materialist counter is?
Your awareness of the experience is constituted, at least in part, by your having it. Your conscious recognition that you have a headache is not based on an inward observation. It is constituted by your undergoing the headache, which in turn is constituted by your C fibers firing.
So if directly observing a sensation simply means having that sensation, then the privacy is tautological. I can only have my sensations, therefore only I can directly observe them.
Precisely. If only you can directly observe your sensations simply means only you can have your C fiber firing, then the apparent privacy of the mental is accommodated entirely within the material world without having to posit a non-material substance.
So it reframes the asymmetry entirely.
And it tells powerfully against the Cartesian picture by offering a plausible materialist depiction of self-awareness.
That is a very successful philosophical maneuver. It turns the seeming uniqueness of inner access into a trivial physical tautology. But now, for the toughest challenge, the one that stumps everyone, the ontological gap, the qualitative difference between mind and brain.
This is the stickiest issue. My subjective experience of seeing a red bus is vivid, memorable, and saturated with color. How can this be identical to a gray, electrical, complex neurological process? The qualities seem utterly unlike.
Right, and the dualist relies on this obvious difference, encapsulated in Leibniz's famous analogy.
Leibniz's mill. It's an incredibly intuitive argument.
It is.
Leibniz asked us to imagine entering a giant, complex machine, a mill constructed to produce thought, feeling, and perception. He argued that upon entering, you would only see parts impinging on one another, levers, motions, mechanisms, but nothing that would explain or reveal perception itself, let alone the feeling of red.
So he concluded that the explanation must therefore be sought in a simple, non-material substance.
Yes. It seems obvious that the qualities of conscious experience differ fundamentally from the qualities of a brain. A brain state is gray, wet, and electrical. A visual experience is red, spacious, and vivid. How do you close that gap?
I don't see how.
The identity theorist closes this gap by demonstrating that the dualist objection relies on a crucial and often overlooked error, confusing the qualities of the experience with the qualities of the object experienced.
The non-conflation principle.
That's it. Let's spend time on this distinction because it's the core defense of the identity theory. When I look at the red bus, the bus itself is red, massive, and perhaps noisy.
Right. That's the external object.
That is the external object. But your experience of seeing the red bus is one thing and the bus is another. The identity theory identifies your experience with some occurrence in your brain, the C fiber equivalent for sight, let's say. When you reflect on the qualities of that experience, those qualities are not to be confused with the qualities of the object observed.
The experience itself is not red.
Precisely. An experience of something red, massive, and smelly is not itself red, massive, or smelly. If it were, every time you looked at a bus, part of your brain would literally turn red and massive. The brain state, which is the experience, does not have to literally possess the properties of the bus.
This feels like philosophical sleight of hand, though. If I have to tell a blind person that the experience of red isn't actually red, haven't we just defined the essence of consciousness out of existence? Doesn't the very vividness of the experience resist being categorized as just a neural firing pattern?
That vividness is the heart of the qualitative difference. But the identity theorist argues that once you rigorously maintain the non-conflation principle, the intuition against identity weakens significantly. The force of Leibniz's intuition relies heavily on us tacitly conflating the qualities of experiences with qualities of objects experienced.
So, once we firmly separate the object from the act of experiencing it,
It becomes much less obvious that the qualities of experiences could not turn out to be neurological qualities. We only perceive them as non-physical because we mistake them for the properties of the external world. The identity theorist has successfully shifted the burden.
so the dualist must now precisely define what experiential qualities are, stripped of their external reference, and then explain why those pure subjective qualities must be fundamentally non-physical.
A much harder task.
And this distinction also helps us make sense of bizarre mental phenomena like dreams or hallucinations.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Suppose you hallucinate a massive pink elephant. Nothing in your brain is pink or elephant-shaped. But this doesn't cast doubt on the existence of the hallucination itself.
Because the experience isn't pink or elephant-shaped, it is a neurological process that represents or constitutes the experience of a pink elephant.
Exactly. The physical process that constitutes the experience doesn't need to resemble the content of the experience, only to be identical to the experience itself.
So the identity theory offers a powerful, parsimonious account. It accommodates the epistemic asymmetry of access, and it defends against the ontological quality gap by clarifying the difference between the experienced object and the brain state that does the experiencing.
We have navigated the historical shift from the total denial of the inner mind in behaviorism, which failed dramatically, to the stronger claim that the mind is the brain, supported by the mind-brain identity theory.
But identity theory, despite its power, is not the last word. There is a deeply challenging issue that remains, which hits at the heart of the subjective feeling of self, the unity of experience.
This is the lingering problem. Neurobiology shows us the brain is a complex, fragmented system of distributed neural processing. Different tasks, vision, memory, emotion, are handled by separate, highly specialized areas.
Right.
Yet your consciousness seems to contain a single ego, a unified point of view or perspective. You don't feel like a collection of separate operating systems. You feel like you.
If the brain is distributed, where does this single unified perspective reside? We know that hopes for a neurological central processing unit, a single seat of consciousness, have pretty much faded.
And even if a specific area were located, it's not clear how its physical operation would account for the unity of experience. The point of view is a complex phenomenon. It is the vantage point from which the world is apprehended. It's been analogized to the eye's relation to the visual field.
How so?
The eye is the source of the vision, but the eye is not within the visual field. It stands at its limit. It apprehends the field from a certain position.
So the materialist must find a place for this unified point of view wholly within the physical world, not just a system of disconnected processing centers. How can a fragmented system produce a unified perspective?
It demands being very clear on the nature of appearance and the character of points of view. If you analyze a complex system, you see all the components. But the subjective point of view might be an emergent property, something that arises only when the system is operating holistically.
But that's still a big question mark.
It is. If materialism is true, the unified point of view must ultimately be a complex physical process. But defining exactly which process and why it yields that subjective unity remains one of the biggest challenges.
And this struggle leads us directly to the next major movement, one that tried to address the identity theory's biggest operational flaw. The identity claim pain is C-fiber firing made the mind too rigid.
That's right. The most significant philosophical attacks on the identity theory centered on the claim that mental states are not best understood as specific material states, like C-fiber firing, but rather as functional states.
Defined by their causal role, or the job they do within the overall system, regardless of what material performs that job.
Exactly.
If pain is identical to C-fiber firing, then only creatures with C-fibers can feel pain. That means aliens, robots, or advanced future life forms made of silicon couldn't technically be in pain, even if they acted exactly like they were.
And that seems counterintuitive.
It does.
It is the problem of multiple realizability. The identity theory tied mental states to specific biochemistry. Functionalism says the mental state, the pain, is the function of signaling tissue damage and initiating withdrawal behavior. That function can be realized in carbon-based brains, silicon chips, or even an elaborate system of water pipes.
So it is the causal organization, not the material, that matters.
That's the core idea. And this shift from identity theory to functionalism is the major path taken by cognitive science. And it's where we go next.
So to wrap this up,
We have completed a comprehensive deep dive into the initial phases of modern materialism. We navigated the historical shift from the total denial of the inner mind and behaviorism, which was foiled by the interdependence of beliefs, to the stronger, more robust claim that the mind is the brain, supported by the mind-brain identity theory.
and we've seen how powerful linguistic analysis and scientific parsimony can motivate these views.
We have.
The core philosophical lesson we took away today is critical thinking applied to our intuitions. We must be extraordinarily careful not to mistake the qualities of what we observe, the red bus, the external world, for the qualities of the observation process itself, the neurological state.
That non-conflation principle is what saved the identity theorist from the classic dualist attack.
But the ghost of dualism still lingers, specifically around the feeling of what its likeness.
It does. So here is the final provocative thought we leave you with, one that speaks directly to that enduring quality gap.
Let's hear it.
If future neuroscientists, using tools far beyond our imagination, can perfectly map the neurological process that constitutes your unique, unified point of view, the objective, complete material account of your subjective perspective, would that comprehensive third-person knowledge actually tell us what it is like to be you in the way you know it?
If the objective material facts are all there, but they still don't bridge that subjective gap, what does that truly imply about the limits of scientific explanation? Perhaps the facts about consciousness include more than just the physical facts, even if we are pure materialists.
Certainly.
Something to chew on until the next deep dive.